Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Jacqueline and Claudia live series. So today we're going to discuss the way out from an eating disorder, the way out from hypothalamic amenorrhea. And for all of you that are new to this space, I am Claudia. I'm a nutrition and dietetic clinician, and I work specifically with women that suffer from disordered eating behaviors and hypothalamic amenorrhea and infertility. And I'm here today with my real great friends, Jacqueline Byrne, which is a clinical psychotherapist that specializes in eating disorder and disordered eating behaviors. So first of all, welcome back, Jacqueline. How are you doing?
I'm doing so well, Claudia, really enjoying the sunshine that's found its way back to Sydney, and very heartened to speak about this topic because when you and I last joined together, we had quite a serious conversation about the dangers of eating disorders, the consequences ultimately that come from long-term HA and disordered eating behavior. And we really wanted to complete that conversation, extending into, well, now we know that. Now we have the truth on the table. How do we actually turn this around? How do we get out of these situations? And I can't wait to hear what you've got to say and talk about that in a lot more depth today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that in the last live, we sounded like the negative Nancy because we really focused and underlined all the negatives of being in an eating disorder for a long period of time and not having a period for more than 1 year or so. And today we're going to focus more on the strategies. But first of all, what does it mean for you to be out of an eating disorder or to be out of hypothalamic amenorrhea? What is this way out from your perspective?
That is a brilliant question. It's the $1 million question in many ways, and quite controversial in terms of what is recovery and when is someone recovered. I think in the context of what we're talking about today, for the purpose of reducing or avoiding the health consequences we spoke about last time, it means being liberated enough from the behaviors that you can have a high quality of life again, and that you have access to engaging with health protective behaviors and factors that will make it much less likely that those experiences will be crossing your path. So what that probably translates to in most circumstances is easeful eating, flexible eating, reducing compulsive exercise, or no longer having compulsive exercise, and movement just being something that can be in your life for pleasure, for stress relief, for enjoyment, but not being shackled to minimums that you need to complete to feel settled. So the whole picture of a more balanced and gentler life starts to take shape in place of the pointier end of that continuum.
So without further ado, let's get into the nitty-gritty. And today we're going to drawing from tips from personal experience and clinical practice as well. So what's the number one thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about a way out from disorder behaviors that have shaped the life of a person?
I truly think that if I was to say one thing, can I say two things? Because there's two things I really want to say. But if I had to say one thing, if it was a gun to my head, I would just say, just start. Just beginning. I think because it's so overwhelming and there can be so much to be done, that there's a health component, a physical health component, there's a mental health component, there might be logistical, practical components to overcome. It's really hard to know where to begin. And should I speak to a dietitian first? Should I speak to a psychotherapist first? Should I go to my GP? Should I just read this book? Any of those things might be the right starting point, and from there you'll be led to what you next need. But just beginning, just pulling the thread so that the ball can start to unravel. But the second thing I want to add quite quickly on the back of that is to reach out to a professional, because while I would rather anyone just get started than stay stuck, getting started can also take people further down rabbit holes if they're being guided by someone that doesn't specialize in eating disorders and HA recovery, or it is maybe not a professional at all. For example, like a well-meaning community member that maybe has some lived experience but doesn't understand the complex impacts of malnutrition on the brain, or someone that, like a book that someone might have written about their lived experience, which is really comforting and relatable, but doesn't offer what you need to do in your life to start to find change. So a professional, whether that's a nutritionist, a therapist that does have eating disorder, HA specialization, will be best placed to help you find the next steps.
I fully agree with point number 2. And to go back to point number 1, I really find that happens don't normally change. The changes don't happen in breakthrough, but it happens in micro shifts. So for some women, for example, if they're really fearful of having breakfast in the morning or having a complete lunch, the change doesn't have to be to start having breakfast and lunch and dinner every single day, but it could be simply adding in something extra so that they can slowly but very steadily creating new habits. And in order to do so, it's very important to get that support from a professional that can actually guide them through all the changes, that can also modulate their feelings about the changes that have been implemented. And normally when I start some women in the recovery journey, I always go back to the reasons why they're doing so, why they have decided to change their current life, their current routine. And I would like to bring up the analogy of a workplace. Let's say that you're working in an office where all your coworkers are fantastic. It's very close to home. You have a regular paycheck. Everything is under control, but you have a very bossy boss, which is quite a bully. So every single day is a drag going to the office. Every single Sunday night, you find yourself crying about the idea of spending 8 hours at work. So it's more about ways the pros and cons of staying in that situation, whilst understanding why you want to get out of that situation, knowing that getting out of that situation means changing your routine, putting yourself in a situation where you have to do different interviews, where you're going to be rejected, where you're going to feel very uncomfortable, but knowing that ultimately at the end of it, you won't be crying every single Sunday night. And sometimes I love analogy, especially in this space, because it's very important for the brain, especially for a person that's been living with an eating disorder and disorder behaviors for a long time, to actually see the same situation happening in a different environment, so that their brain can actually catch up with the idea of what it will look like to change. What do you feel about this analogy, Jacqueline?
And that's wonderful. That's a wonderful way to scaffold and visualize that change. I love the term micro shifts as well, because it's much less intimidating. And I think we have this narrative of hitting rock bottom and having an epiphany and making a grand gesture and turning our lives around overnight. That's very much like a blockbuster movie concept of how we find change in our life that we've subconsciously taken on. So we're sort of waiting to feel this download of motivation, or waiting for something to happen to change our mind. And it usually doesn't look like that. And even if it does, if there might be a health scare or something that happens, which we feel hugely motivated by, it's often doesn't last very long, because habit is so strong and beliefs that are entrenched, whatever it is that's caused this behavior to begin and continue is still there, despite that awareness of health risk or whatever has rocked our world temporarily. So to not wait for that is incredibly important. And I really value that you've brought that up. To just little things building up allows it not to shock our nervous system, and we might be able to lean into that change more permanently.
How would you address a situation where a client says, I feel that mentally I am recovered, but physically they're still deep in the trenches of an eating disorder, where they can be emaciated to the point that they actually need medical support, or to the other extreme where they cannot stop the binging and overeating cycle. But whenever you have a conversation with them, they actually say, yeah, but mentally I am absolutely recovered. How would you address that feeling of stuckness, I would say?
It's quite common, and that's something I would want people to know, that it's not unusual at all for people to feel like that and express that. And it speaks to a couple of things I'd want to bring up. One being, I think it really highlights how there are different parts of us that can coexist, that whether it's the part of us that might present at work that's quite highly functional and organized and able to express itself at a certain level, and then another version of us that's fighting with our partner late at night on the same day when we're tired and frustrated and we've been triggered. And it would seem that those two behaviors, the level of functionality, the level of insight, is in strong contrast, but they're both from the same person within a short amount of time. And that's what it's like to live with an eating disorder as well, that there can be this presenting part that's very high functioning, intellectually understands things in great detail. Like, that part is not untrue at all. It's very, very real. It's just that there's another part that's at a very different place. And maybe those two parts aren't communicating, or when that other part gets scared or gets behind the driver's wheel, the part that is recovered, the mental part that's recovered, isn't online anymore. Sorry, Claire.
No, please go ahead. I want to hear the however.
However, I am aware that there are strong voices in the eating disorder recovery space, in the clinical sector, that would say you're not recovered in that mental space if you're not recovered in the physical space, because one begets the other. So that and I think that needs some unpacking, that absolutely you can understand it, absolutely you can get it, some parts of it you can live, but if you can't sit down and have a meal, that's challenging. Or if you can't then do the behavior that is a part of mental recovery, that's then missing, because it's the mental part that needs to do that behavior, not the physical part. So if it truly was split, the physical part would just be about rehabilitation of nutrition, right? And the mental part would facilitate that because it's recovered. But I think that's important to say, because what gets exposed is whatever's going to come up in doing the behavior to gain weight or to improve nutrition is the part that isn't mentally recovered yet. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I do believe that if a person is not physically recovered, then a part of their brain space is still taken over by the eating disorder. So I don't truly believe that they can also be mentally recovered, even though they feel that they've come leaps and bounds compared to where they were at the beginning of their journey. And they've gained a huge insights about their feelings and their emotions. I still believe that getting their body in a healthy, whatever healthy mean nowadays, but into a well-being space is very important. So let's say that we got this incredible clients that has decided to recover, has gone through all the whys they want to recover. They have taken their first very unsteady step. They've challenged themselves to do something small and they don't know where to go from here. Actually, let me ask you something that I think that it's really important to unpack and address in terms of challenging. How would you feel about challenging ourselves as a first step of the recovery journey? Because that it goes back to what we said about breakthrough and micro shifts. And lots of people, they do tend to start their recovery journey by challenging their fearful thoughts, the most fearful type of foods, for example, the most fearful type of meal. Let's say that they haven't had ice cream for 20 years, and all of a sudden they tell themselves, I'm going to recover, and that's the first meal that I'm going to have. How would you feel about that?
I think that can be workable, that idea of challenging self and prompting what is important within that is ensuring there are other resources to follow up with, because if that's been something that's been avoided for so long, there's probably a good reason why. And throwing ourselves in the deep end isn't necessarily going to be helpful if it reaffirms, yeah, that was terrifying, that was horrific, let's never do that again. And we just we consolidate the fear. But there's something very powerful in, sorry, Claudia. Pardon me. There's something very, like, I feel a lot of admiration for that person that wants to challenge themselves, and that says a lot about their commitment to recovery. I think as well, like, another unhelpful narrative we have in our culture around change is that jumping in the deep end is a good idea. Like, just go for it, do it. And in some situations that can be helpful, but with something that's this compacted and complex, it can add further resistance because it ultimately becomes a very negative experience.
I call it the exposure therapy, and normally the analogy is with the fear of flying. So if you haven't stepped on an airplane for many years, and all of a sudden you decide to challenge your behaviors by taking the 17 hours plane that bring you from Sydney to London, possibly is not the best idea, because if the flight goes smoothly, that's fantastic. Then it's definitely an exposure that reinforces your feelings that you can do it, that you can fly. But if during the flight there are some bumps, there are some challenges, or maybe there is someone sitting next to you that it snores for the majority of the time, that can make you even more fearful of flying the next time. So I don't think that starting the recovery process by jumping into the deep end, as you said, is ultimately the best behavior, simply because if it goes well, fantastic. You have proven to yourself that you can actually do it, and you are more keen to try again. But if it doesn't go well, and if the anxiety spikes, then it's going to reinforce the belief, see, you cannot do it. You cannot recover. This is too hard, and I'm going to give up. So what would you say that the best first step could be?
I do think that's really individual. Maybe a way of gauging that would be something that's under 7 out of 10 in terms of how strong it feels in your body, how scary it feels. So back solving something that feels like it's too far out of reach, maybe going out for a meal with a friend to an unknown restaurant, you don't know the menu, is a 10 out of 10. Maybe it's, why don't we pack a lunch from home and meet up at a park and sit by the lake and have it together? And that kind of feels like a 6 or a 7 out of 10. And that will help you build the threshold in your body and your nervous system to sit with discomfort.
And in terms of seeking support from a professional, how often do you think that it's advisable to see a professional during the recovery journey, especially in the first stage?
Again, it can be quite individual depending on what the behaviors look like for you and where you're at in terms of levels of distress and other supports around you as well. But usually if someone's entering into treatment for the first time, or they haven't been in intensive treatment for a period of time, usually it would be once a week with each a therapist and a nutritionist.
I think that we haven't really touched upon what you do specifically in our past conversations. So can I actually tell us more about the work that you do in your
Mm.
clinical practice in terms of supporting someone that really wants to get rid of the disorder behaviors. Which kind of work do you tend to do? And I know that it's very individual and this is a super broad question, but what comes to mind?
Yeah. There's so much to cover. I would be very interested in beginning to understand the relationship they have with their behavior, with the eating disorder, the way that it feels in their life and that they've connected to it, because that will be essential for understanding how to create more space from it and preparing for what it will be like to live with less of it, if they choose to. I'd be very inclined to understand more about that person's background, family of origin, upbringing, ideas that were mentioned, not just about food and bodies, but about their value, their worth, who they are. It doesn't always look like someone having a traumatic past or an obviously difficult background, but it's very likely at some point along the line there was something missing or there was an additional need that wasn't met, which the disordered eating behavior sought to fill. So if we can understand what the circumstances were around that, it's again building the skill set to go back and to meet that part of yourself, to gather that part back up now, which often is more childlike, younger parts that got stuck. And the other component I would be very interested to explore with someone in setting up foundations to work through treatment is their capacity to feel their feelings, to be in their body, to sit with discomfort, because again, that will be such a huge part of what we're going to need to be available in order to move forward with recovery, or they would have been able to do it by themselves. That there's a reason that this has been so hard. There's a reason this has been pushed back on. And build that skill set, titrate the growth of capacity to sit somatically with their own feelings, so that if more discomfort is possible, then challenging other behaviors, moving in different directions becomes more possible as well.
Thank you for shining a light of what normally happens behind closed curtains, because I'm pretty sure that some people, they really don't know what to expect from a sessions with you or from a psychologist or a psychotherapist in general. And I think that it's really important to let them know which kind of services you provide and which kind of support they can get out of working with a professional like you. One last question that I wanted to ask you: how do you feel about someone that describe their relationship with their eating disorder as my anorexia, my bulimia, my eating disorder? What would you say to that?
There can be a lot of attachment to these behaviors that can be part of to what I was speaking to around needing to fill the gap in our formative years in some way, that it almost is like the security blanket. It's like it can almost feel like a sacred part of us, or a hugely important relationship. So that language I would be interested in, the ownership of it, the sense of unity with it. And I would just want to be very respectful around that, because recovery doesn't happen because people are bulldozed into it, or they're fear-mongered into it, or they're given an ultimatum around something. It happens because they ultimately feel safe enough to try something different, and then they can build on that and build and create a new world for themselves. So understanding why it feels like yours, and why it feels, because it often does feel like someone's identity, like they're maybe even grown up being the anorexic girl, or the underweight person, or felt like they were seen as different or strange, or maybe put up on a pedestal for having a certain body type or being very athletic. Whatever it has looked like, it's very often part of our identity and a huge part of our story. So it's quite appropriate for there to be a minus to a component of it, but then a curiosity around, well, how do we go forward from there in allowing other parts of your identity to blossom beyond it.
Yeah, and our identity is so multifaceted. So it's not about suppressing one part of the identity, it's about shining the lights on the other part of the identity of the same person. And it's more about looking in the future and the kind of and the values that are present in the current period of their life, and so see how they can actually match their values with their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being here. I will see you once again next month with another Juicy Live. And for all of you that are listening, if you would like us to discuss a specific topic, please let us know in the comment sections. We read them all. And if you want to get in touch with Jacqueline, I'm going to put the link to her Instagram account and website down below so that you can definitely get in contact with her. Thank you so much for being here, Jacqueline. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.